This is I want to say this is the fourth Dylan album that we've covered. It's
Didn't we say that last time? Or
I think so.
Well, we definitely covered John Wesley Harding, Nashville, Skyline. Yeah, it's the fourth. Yep.
And Times Are Changin'. So
Times
this is
Are
the
Changin',
fourth
yep.
one.
Mm-hmm.
This is coming in at number 31 on the best ever albums list of the 60s. This is the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. It was the number 2 album in 1963 and number 181 overall. It was recorded over actually a period of 1 year, essentially from April 24th, 1962 through April 24th, 1963. And it was released on May 27th, 1963. This is Dylan's second studio album, and there's 13 tracks on the record, and 11 of them are originals, which when you compare the number of originals from his first album, which were only 2, this is a significant jump up in Dylan's songwriting, and that's kind of one of the main themes that you have with this record, is that Dylan just started writing a ridiculous amount of songs, sometimes upwards of 5 songs in a single setting.
wow.
And while this album was being recorded, there were a number of other songs that he recorded that didn't make the album that have since made their ways onto the bootleg series and and other types of albums that were released later. So Dylan was very prolific at this time.
There's enough songs on this album.
And there are enough songs. This is probably one. I mean, this is like a 50-minute album.
Yeah.
So this is one of the longer ones for the 60s in particular. This is long. So on this album, you have a variety of different themes, but mostly they kind of center around the political themes and inspired by the civil rights movement and also the fear of nuclear war, as well as several love songs. So he's covering all kinds of things. This is the album that really propelled him to stardom and gained him national and international fame. Many people cite this as his first great album. And it reached number 22 on the charts and would eventually go platinum, selling roughly 10,000 copies per month. Which was way more than his first album sold about 5,000 copies in its first year. So this was a significant step forward. This album was very inspirational and for the Beatles. I know John wants to always incorporate the Beatles into this. So John Lennon recalled that in Paris in 1964 was the first time I ever heard Dylan at all. Paul got the record from a French DJ, and for 3 weeks in Paris, we didn't stop playing it. We all went potty about Dylan, which I've never heard as an expression. Apparently they liked him so much they just went to the bathroom all the time. And then I found another quote from AllMusic. Stephen Thomas, a critic at Stephen Thomas Erlewine from AllMusic said, quote, "It's hard to overestimate the importance of the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, the record that firmly established Dylan as an unparalleled songwriter. This is rich, imaginative music, capturing the sound and spirit of America as much as that of Louis Armstrong, Hank Williams, or Elvis Presley. Dylan, in many ways, recorded music that equaled this, but he never topped it." In 2002, it was. We've talked about this before. It was one of the first 50 albums chosen by the Library of Congress to be added to the National Recording Registry. I think we might need to do a cleaning of the stacks on that a little bit and figure out exactly what that is, but it sounds pretty important.
It's considered like influential, important to American culture.
Right, but who gets to decide
albums.
that? Like that's kind of or just like the history of it, that type of thing. So
America's librarian.
Yeah, exactly. So we talked a little bit, I believe, in the last episode about John Hammond, who was the individual at Columbia record producer that signed Dylan initially. And after Dylan's original album, first album that, like I said, barely sold 5,000 copies, Bob Dylan became known as Hammond's Folly. But Hammond still strongly believed in Dylan and pushed for the second album to be a success. And this album has a lot of inspiration from this album came from then Dylan's girlfriend, Suze Rotolo, who you guys might recognize from the cover of this record because she is the one linking arms with Dylan walking down a wintry New York street.
I was wondering who that was.
Yep. So that was Dylan's girlfriend. They were living together, and her family had a strong left leanings, and some members of her family were members of the American Communist Party. And Dylan had always attributed that, to her with, being someone that was way more into the civil rights movement and politics than he ever was. But after living with Dylan for 6 months, Rotolo moved to Italy to study art, and many speculate that the love songs in this album were mainly directed towards her. So this is also the time where Albert Grossman, Dylan's manager, who would become Dylan's manager, enters the picture. He persuades Dylan to transfer his publishing rights to a company called Whitmark Music, which Dylan did in July of 1962. But Grossman didn't already tell him that he had an agreement struck with Whitmark that gave Grossman 50% cut of their publishing shares of any artist that Grossman would bring to them. So he was a very shrewd businessman, and this would become one of the cornerstones of a legal battle that ensued between Dylan and Grossman in the late 1980s, because things did not end too well between the two of them. But he did become Dylan's manager in August of '62. But he also, of course, butted heads with Hammond, and he tried to argue that Grossman tried to argue that Dylan's contract with Hammond and Columbia was invalid since Dylan signed it when he was under 21 years of age. And Hammond responded by actually getting Dylan to re-sign a contract saying, we're going to keep the old contract in place like you agreed on the terms that we had there. And so Grossman was not happy with that. And so kind of tying this full circle with CTS trivia, Grossman basically forces Hammond out of the production studio, and Columbia is then replacing Hammond with none other than
Johnson?
Tom Wilson.
Okay.
No, Johnson came later.
Okay.
CTS legend Tom Wilson, who recalled, quote, I didn't even particularly like folk music. I had been recording Sun Ra and Coltrane. I thought folk music was for the dumb guys. Dylan played like the dumb
That's a great quote.
Dylan played like the dumb guys, but then these words came out and I was flabbergasted. So that
is the best description of folk I've ever heard how Bob Dylan transcended folk. It really is a perfect description of it.
That's a good description of this album too.
The dumb guys.
Wink, wink.
So the last thing I said, this is also around the time that Dylan refused to play Ed Sullivan. There was some censorship that was going around Dylan's lyrical content. Most notably for Ed Sullivan, Dylan was going to play the song Talkin' John Birch Society Blues, Talkin' John Birch Paranoid Blues. But then I guess the Ed Sullivan show felt that would be libelous towards the John Birch Society, and Columbia actually insisted that it not be included on the Freewheelin' album. So there wasn't much Dylan could do about that, but it's kind of interesting where they decided to draw the line, because there's certainly some other songs on here that can be seen as controversial, but it's probably just because he called out John Birch, and it was just probably too specific. But anyway, that's a little bit of a history of the album here. Let's go with our thoughts. John, we'll start with you. How do you like this folky Dylan album?
I liked it. I really did. It's like, as you listen to this album, this is probably more so than any other album, the album that sounds like what the Dylan that is later parodied sounds like, right? Mm-hmm. Because this begins to create that template. That's not a knock, because while some of that stuff is funny, you have to be it to inspire that level of parody and, be viewed that way. The songwriting is extremely strong on this album. I know that sometimes I laugh and say Dylan can get a little bit esoteric or, viewed as being profound when some of his stuff is just ridiculous, but that's not the case on this album. These are really strong songs. They're the narrative approach that we would see in the later 60s albums that we've covered in Nashville, Skyline, and John Wesley Harding, but much more personally tied, as opposed to being wide sketches of characters. There's still a little bit of the wide sketches of characters in songs like Ballad of Hollis Brown and Boots of Spanish Leather, Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, but it feels a lot more like Bob Dylan is embodied in these tales, more so than the later albums. I don't know if that makes sense, but it feels a little bit more autobiographical as opposed to standing aside and not attached.
But those are songs from the times are changing, though.
Right, that's what that's what I'm saying.
You're talking about the time period?
I'm talking about the time period, right? Yeah.
Okay.
So there's that, but then on this album, he doesn't go that route, and instead he goes into like more autobiographical stuff. And I wonder if that's
there is a
because
song
of the
called
relationship.
Bob Dylan's Dream on here, and
Right.
Bob Dylan's Blues. So.
Right. Well, but I guess, and maybe I got ahead of myself and I should have saved it for that album, but it's, you know, when he's talking about the girl from the North Country, you feel like, you know, Bob Dylan knows who the girl from the North Country is, right? As opposed to just standing back and knowing who it is.
Right.
And that's, I guess, what I was going for. And yeah, there's two different songs. There's Bob Dylan's Blues and Bob Dylan's Dream, right? So you can't get any more literal than that. So, and I think that was what the takeaway for me was, is that he was still very much a confessional singer. I think CTS legend Tom Wilson, though, got it. It wasn't the folk music that made, and this is where I think, I don't know if I will fall in line with many of Dylan aficionados. Bob Dylan didn't, for me, become a transcendent musician until he started going electric. He became a transcendent songwriter in this period, where he was able to take folk and make folk not sound shitty to people that didn't like folk, right? You know, that's what his great gift was, you know, whether it be the Beatles listening to it or me listening to it now or anybody. Although I would argue it wasn't until he goes electric that you start to get Dylan albums that you really can appreciate for the music as much, because in this it's still just a lot of strumming of the guitar, folk, you know, template. And that would be my description. It is an album that takes folk from being a niche, sort of limited genre into a stronger genre, and that is solely because Bob Dylan is a phenomenal songwriter who has an ear for being able to write a narrative that usually doesn't overstay its welcome, especially at this point in time. I would much rather bounce off of your opinions on this, though, because I don't feel like I did a very good job of describing myself there. Josh, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, this is an essential album in understanding who Bob Dylan is, right? And the career and kind of the progression of him as an artist. You know, we talked about him switching to electric at some point and how that kind of changed things. And this is understanding where he is at the beginning, right? And the folk and that folk background and where the strengths of his songwriting, like you said, John, come from. And this album really is all about the lyrics for me, at least, right? Because the music itself is not, it's kind of sounds a little the same from song to song, or at least there's some kind of like repetition, the themes, you know, it's just him on the acoustic and harmonica. There's no backing musicians or anything like that, so it's very stripped down, and it's really letting his lyrics and the songs content shine through, and it's very good, like you said, John, but you're not going to be blown away by kind of the complex instrumentation or anything of that nature. If you hadn't heard this before, it would be hard to press to meet somebody who hadn't heard some of these songs before, like Blowing in the Wind or Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. Listening to it this time, I really liked Don't Think Twice, It's All Right as a song. I feel like that was one of kind of the more complex, or at least kind of upbeat songs off of this album. And I've always had a soft spot for A Girl from the North Country as well. I really like that song. And I guess those are kind of my initial thoughts. How about Matt, you jump in and see how much.
So I love Dylan. And I love this record, and I see everything that you're saying. I can't really argue a whole lot, but I will say for me, even though not being the lyric guy, this is an album that to me lyrics certainly stand out, but I also love the music behind it, and it's not complex, right? But when I hear something like Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, which that's to me is easily a top 5 Dylan song for me, you know, including because even though there's not variety here. It's basically the same thing over and over. It's a classic Dylan song that's just like, it's 7 minutes long. It's just verse after verse after verse.
That's a good
song
point.
is, that song he's described that as every line in that song is the opening line to a song that I just didn't have the time to write. is what he said. Like it's just like it's just like this stream of consciousness type of thing that he's doing, but the way that it builds, both I hear it lyrically and I hear it in his voice, the way that he's singing it, and the way that like the verses, like I think the last verse it goes longer than any of the other ones. Like he just keeps repeating and repeating and repeating the thoughts. And it just hits me. That song crushes me. It's so, I love Dylan's voice. I love what he's doing with the guitar, and it's so simple, but it's so great. And it's one of the things that's so great about Dylan is that he can take something very, like, he doesn't need to do a whole lot with something, and it just makes it like a perfect song. But then he's got stuff that's very melodic. Like you're right. Like Don't Think Twice, It's All Right. It's more of a melodic song. I think that might be how I would describe that.
I think that's probably why it resonated with me.
And
more.
Same thing with Girl from the North Country. And I love the juxtaposition. You've got Girl from the North Country. It's the second track on the album. It's just this beautiful, heartbreaking kind of love song. And then it goes right into what I would say, is probably Dylan's angriest like song ever, Masters of War. Yeah. Holy shit. I hope you die, like he's saying at the end. I'm going to stand over your grave till I'm sure that you're dead. This guy is, that song is probably one of the most powerful anti-war songs you're ever going to listen to, and it's just got this great guitar part. It's like and true to form, like a lot of these Dylan acoustic songs, back in the acoustic days, a lot of this music is taken from traditionals that he's kind of morphed into his own. So even though he's taking writing credit on the majority of the songs here, a lot of the pieces of the musically are being taken from like these spirituals or these like traditional songs from like the 1600s or whatever, but he is still taking it and making it his own. But this is the record that really Peter, Paul and Mary did a cover of Blowin' in the Wind 3 weeks. They recorded it 3 weeks after the release of this record, and that song skyrocketed to like number 2 on the charts. Wow.
And also shows exactly what Tom Wilson said, because it is folk without the thing that Bob Dylan brings to folk music. Mm-hmm. And you can listen to Bob Dylan without liking folk music, but I think that's what really is illustrative to me of what makes him unique, right? Because if you don't like folk, you can listen to those songs back to back, and I can guarantee you which one you'll like better.
Right, yes.
If you like folk, I can also guarantee you that you'll like the other one better, because the clarion clear singing, the harmony, the minimalist nature of it, it doesn't have the edge, and that's what I think people love about folk, right? Yeah. And it's also what I don't love sometimes about early Dylan is that he still is root. It's what Bob Dylan himself doesn't love about early Bob Dylan when you read about him. It's like when you read about it, he doesn't exactly reminisce about this time as his greatest work. He definitely is more partial to the mid and late parts of it. And I tend to be on the same boat as Bob Dylan is about his work, because I do think it adds to it.
And one of the things that Dylan didn't like, because this was the album where people started calling him the voice of this generation, and he never liked that, that moniker, and he always kind of poo-pooed it. And he even said with a lot of these songs, he's like, these songs they were just out there, right? They existed before me. I just put them down on paper. If I didn't do it, somebody else would have. So like, it's not a big deal. Like, everybody relax, kind of a thing. So there's definitely some truth to that,
They're better than that, even though I'm not as enthusiastic. I'd like to say that's clear understatement by Bob Dylan.
And if you read a lot, go ahead.
Well, just his role in creating rock music is every bit as big as the Beatles, because but I think that his role enhances when he goes electric. To me, Dylan before he goes electric is an entity that you can appreciate, but I almost feel as if sometimes it gets romanticized because of what Dylan was. You go, oh, well, I don't want to pick the ones that are the obvious ones. So what am I going to pick? Let me go back to when he was pure. And I think one of the great things about Bob Dylan as an artist is he doesn't allow you to indulge in that. It's like, well, no, like I took these I think I remember watching a documentary where he talked about like plugging in his guitar, and he talked about the folk scene. And I believe his direct quote was that the people that complain about that stuff are the wussies and the pussies, was his description. And like, it's just very funny because I think he very much has an awareness of what the view of his legacy is at each step, while he also minimizes it. And as Josh said, it's essential to hear this to see what Bob Dylan is and why he's different. But I feel like he'll get to the point where he becomes Bob Dylan with a capital B, capital D a little later.
Well, and it's also, I would say that's a similar thing with the Beatles in that, like, the early Beatles stuff was great, but what made the Beatles like this more of an iconic band was what they did in the middle and latter part of their career. And I think, just changing the direction of your music and changing the sound and such a new and different, fresh way is like what puts them over the edge, right? But the early stuff is still great stuff.
It's formative, but also you don't have an audience that's sitting there and talking about that stuff as being the best stuff they ever did, because there's not a devoted genre of music that's looking at white bands that are covering like black music, you know what I mean? Like they kind of transcended it, and black bands started doing mainstream black music, and white bands started, expanding out into other stuff, right? But folk still has a committed audience that wants to have that narrative, right? And I'm not knocking it, but I'm saying that's, I think, where some of it comes from.
Well,
you never hear anybody say, even as great as we thought A Hard Day's Night was, how many people have you heard say, well, the best Beatles album's A Hard Day's Night? Even though it's probably a fairer argument to make than you could, than people would admit.
See, that's an interesting thing, because I bet you there's people out there that would think that early Beatles is their favorite, but like, would they say that it's the best? I mean, maybe. Because I could see that being more appealing to someone than Sgt. Pepper.
Well, like me, for example.
Right.
Are there any Beatles fans that was like, I stopped listening after Rubber Soul?
Yeah.
There probably are. There probably. I mean, they have to. I mean, so many people out there, right? And the Beatles were immensely popular in those early years. That when they probably came out there, they're like, "What is this? This isn't She Loves You," So it's a very interesting question, but I would say that they both, and there's probably other artists that we can say this too, that their early stuff is great and it's like this profound, had this profound impact, but then they just did something later on that totally like, all right, now they're like in this pantheon of like great musicians or artists. And I would say too, I would be remiss if I didn't mention there's humor in this record too, like particularly with talking World War III blues. Like it's funny, man. You listen to him talk this story about like the end of the world, and I'm walking around in this dream, and like all this craziness is happening, and it's and for a dude that was like 21 when he wrote all this stuff, I mean, let's think about that too.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's unbelievable how he.
Well, and you think of you think of like Bob Dylan being world weary from the cradle, right? And it's interesting to hear albums where he's not as world weary. He's already bringing in some of those themes, but it is kind of fun to hear like a clearly younger, very idealistic Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
And that's in here, and that did stand out as a definite positive of this album.
I think it's also worth emphasizing the fact, like that you said, Matt, that he switched to having so many original songs versus doing the covers. We've discussed that time and again with the bands that we've covered, how they've taken a step back, step up when they've started writing their original material, like the Rolling Stones and like the Beatles and like so many other bands that we've talked about.
But I would say that what's even more impressive about Dylan is that he did it so quickly. It was one album. He's like, all right, I'm good. Right. Like let's get into it. Like the Beatles took like 5 or 6 before they did like consistently their own stuff. Same thing probably with the Stones.
And that's why it's so important to put the albums in this decade in particular in the time frame, I think, because you've got all these albums from 1966 to 1969 that are expanding the bar. But when you look at this album in the context of 1964, correct? Like, or is it 63? 63, right?
Yeah.
It becomes even more impressive, because if you were to look at the rest of that chart, what the hell else is on that chart that's doing this? Nothing. Yeah. And that's where if this album gets released in 1968, right, then it gets received, it's different, but it probably has the same effect that John Wesley Harding did, which we liked, right? But it just kind of is, that's another Dylan album, right? But here in this, like, the context of it is so important, because it only maximizes, what this must have sounded like in the time period. Because there's, you look at the rest of the chart, it's one-hit wonders and, I love Motown, but, Motown, pretty standard stuff. There is no rock music of which to speak. The folk he's up against is like Peter, Paul, and Mary and Joan Baez, and no offense to them, but they don't bring anywhere near as much to the table as Dylan does.
And to give you context of what we've done so far, there's only 5 albums from 1963 that we're covering.
I was wondering about that.
We did With the Beatles, Live at the Apollo by James Brown, Please Please Me by the Beatles, and this is number 2. And then the number 1 album we're going to get to is Charles Mingus, right? So it's a jazz record.
It's couched in jazz, early Beatles, who are sort of bringing an R&B sound, and then James Brown, who's underground at this point, like not even acknowledged really by mainstream culture, right? So he's not on. No, I'm saying he's not on the charts, right?
I'm sorry, I was laughing at something different because I'm seeing number 6 is Sam Cooke, number 7 is Thelonious Monk, and then number 8 is a various artists. A Christmas Gift for You from Phil Spector by various is number 8 from 1963. So that's what you're dealing with. Yeah, that's the.
Yep.
So that's a good point, John. Yeah, that which speaks to even more to what Dylan was was doing and how this was just like when people heard this must have been like what
even
the
that
hell
Animals
is this?
and those Kinks, even those Animals and those Kinks albums that we've done that were early were like 1964. So they're not even around yet. That raw garage rock sound. So yeah, I do want to mention that because I don't want to be seen as being a guy that's like shitting on because I am aware of what his role is. I just happen to like when he plugs in the guitars more.
Yeah, and we're gonna talk about that in the coming weeks. So, but
I've also learned I love country Bob Dylan, which was a revelation. Yeah.
But I would probably say that if you like the folkier Dylan, if that's kind of like if you like folk music, this is probably the album that I'd point you to start with. I mean, this is probably I would say his best. I think this is better than what is it? Times Are Changin'. And Another Side of Bob Dylan. This is because this has like 5 or 6 quintessential Dylan songs that are just iconic.
I would agree. Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would also say that much like there's certain books you should read, even if you feel the book is middle of the road, but you need to read it. This is the equivalent of that in rock music. If you're going to say that you are a person who is well listened to in music, you cannot ignore Bob Dylan in this period. You may not have to like it or love it or anything, but to not listen to it is to leave you underserved in terms of an awareness of music, especially 60s music and the progression of it. So I would say it's an essential listen for that reason, if nothing else.
Yep, agreed. Yeah, that's all good points all around. Matt, out of curiosity, what I know we're running a little long, but what album got you into Dylan initially, and how were you exposed?
Ooh,
do you remember?
I think it was Blood on the Tracks. I think my brother brought home Blood on the Tracks, and I actually, and from there, I think I got the greatest hits, much like I did a lot of '60s records, and that probably the greatest hits more so than anything was the first album that I got, and then I explored from there.
Gotcha.
God, and Blood on the Tracks is a lifetime after this, right? Like 12 years, I think, isn't it?
That's like
75.
75, yeah. So it's, and that's probably, and just I'll bring this up when we talk about that, but that's probably, if any Dylan album that I would say start with, I would probably say start with Blood on the Tracks.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Yep. Well, this has been a